Welcome everyone to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's presentation is focused on how to lead a study group on the Next Generation Science Standards second public draft. Our presenters tonight are Harold Pratt and Ted Willard. My name is Bryn Slate and I will be moderating, and Jeff Lehman is online with us to provide technical support. I'd like to remind everyone to visit the NSTA Learning Center, your online portal for over 10,200 resources for science educators. Once you arrive in the Learning Center, you'll find that over 3,500 of those resources are free, and that you can add all of the resources to your library so that you can access them to use when it's convenient for you. Our community forums are the place to have discussions with other science teachers about content and pedagogical issues. Our online advisors are available to provide assistance and help you find the resources that you need. And if you're looking for a way to plan your professional learning and reach your goals, you can use our free tools to do that. It's all available by going to learningcenter.nsta.org. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Ted Willard, who's going to begin tonight's presentation. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you very much, Bryn, and welcome to everybody. I'm really happy to have all of you folks here. I think we're all excited to have the draft come out. We've been waiting for some time and anxious to get it, but at least we weren't trying to read it while either opening presents or popping champagne or doing other things. We're now back in the groove and hopefully well rested and ready to pour into it. Tonight we're going to talk about how you can go about in these next 3 weeks going through the draft and working with some of your colleagues, getting a group, whether it's very small or large, or even if it's just you, on how to go about and do a review. I will point out, and I'll ask some of my friends here, colleagues here, to put up a link that will be useful to you down the road of a set of handouts that can guide you through the process. You don't need to reference that document at all this evening. It's just going to be there for you to look at after Harold and I have a chance to give you some guidance about the review, but it gives you some further details to work on here. So we're going to get going here and to go where no one has gone before, into the next generation of science standards, and give you a broad sense of what we're trying to do in this talk. We want you to understand the structure of NGSS and help you sort of figure out how you can connect with your colleagues and really dig into the document and interpret it. And this will all be a useful process for you to go through as you're getting ready to provide feedback to achieve. And even if you don't give feedback, although I strongly encourage you to, it's a good opportunity for you to really look at the standards and start to think about what would you need to do to help your students if these were the standards that you were working on. And so I'm going to start off with some basics about NGSS. For some of you, it might be a little bit of a familiar territory, but I hope everyone gets a chance here to get a little bit more sense about the overall document. Starting with that, I want you to understand what NSTA's role here is. We're a partner along with Achieve, the National Research Council, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, 4 organizations working on development. We're providing guidance to them as they've gone through the processes. We've recommended teachers who are part of the writing team. We have considered it with things like tonight important for us to inform the science education community and to encourage you, again tonight, to play a role in this and have a voice. And finally, again, to learn more about the document. So here are the 4 organizations I was discussing. The National Academies of Sciences, NSTA, Achieve, and AAAS. And here's a general, very broad, high-level outline of what the process is. It began with the development of the framework for K-12 science education that was published in July 2011. Leads the standards, and it's these standards that will be used to craft assessments, curriculum, instruction, and teacher professional development in all the work to eventually make these standards a reality. But to start off with the aspect of the standards themselves, we will go we'll go to, sorry, just a second, take a closer look at that document and just understand that the National Academies is an organization that was chartered by Congress, I believe, by Abraham Lincoln, if I'm remembering right, back early on, that provides advice to the nation on issues in science, engineering, and medicine. They're honorary memberships of people who are prestigious or to be named to the National Academy. Most important, they're advisors in producing independent reports, and the National Research Council carries out most of the studies that are done by the academies. And that's where the Research Council comes in. The framework, if you haven't looked at it, I strongly encourage you to do so. You can get a free copy of it from the National Academy's website, or you can go and purchase a hard copy from NSTA Press. I've done both, like to have on hand the hard copy and the digital. The framework tried to take a number of different documents, benchmarks in the Atlas, the National Science Education Standards, the NAEP Framework, College Board Standards, and NSTA's own work in terms of trying to figure out how to coalesce standards, put those all together. They also took into account other research projects that the National Research had taken into account, how people learn, taking science to school, Ready, Set, Science. And through these, they tried to formate what is it that everyone needs to know and be able to do in science education. And the biggest key piece in all of this is to looking at science education as having three different dimensions that all wind together: scientific and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas. I'll give you a little bit more detail about those. These are examples of the scientific and engineering practices. They are things that students should be able to do in order to investigate the world. I like to refer to it as sort of inquiry plus. It has some aspects about inquiry, like planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data. Has other elements that were in some ways often intended to be part of what inquiry meant, but sometimes didn't always make it into the classroom. Elements like constructing explanations, developing and using models, engaging in argument from evidence, or obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. So this whole set here is designed to be a way for students to investigate. And despite my having it numbered like this, it's not intended to be a 1, 2, 3, 4, do it in this way. It's more of a set of tools that students can use. And so just as you wouldn't just spend a whole day on a work site using nothing but a hammer, you wouldn't spend scientists don't spend one day just doing nothing but developing and using models. They engage in all of these in different ways. I should also note that they don't engage in these just by themselves, but they blend it in their investigation of actual concepts and ideas. So for example, cross-cutting concepts are a second dimension of these three that tie into particular ideas that cut across all of the scientific disciplines. It's not just physics or chemistry or biology, but certain things like patterns or systems and systems models, stability and change. These are ideas that are applicable to all scientific endeavors. Finally, we get into the disciplinary core ideas, sort of when you think of as scientific concepts in life science, earth, in space science, physical science, and a new piece here, engineering, technology, and the application of science. And within each of these four, the framework breaks things down into more specific pieces. And then those are broken down even into more detail. So in energy, definitions of energy, conservation of energy, relationship between energy and forces. And so it gets down to particular concepts that we want students to have an understanding of. But again, it is taking these practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas and winding them all together to make the standards. And as I mentioned that, we'll jump into the whole aspect of the standards that are being developed. So ACHIEVE is the organization that's coordinating a group of 26 states. They were formed back in the 90s by the National Governors Association. They are non-profit, bipartisan, independent. If you've heard of ACHIEVE, other than NGSS, you may know that they've been involved in the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, or the PARC Consortium, which is one of the two main Common Core Standards assessment consortiums. But they are coordinating this group of 26 states, the states that are here in blue. And so each of these states in blue sort of has a seat at the table and has participated in the planning and development of these new standards. They have all pledged that when the standards are completed, they will take a good hard look at the standards and strongly consider adopting them. They haven't promised to do it because no one would do that sight unseen, but they are committed to being serious about this. And once the standards are developed, they will think about that. And I should also mention the states that are in gray that aren't involved, they also will have the opportunity to adopt, and some of them have indicated real interest in exploring that. So there's been a long process in developing these. It goes way back to the summer of 2011 of writers doing things and producing drafts and being reviewed and reworked. We've gotten ourselves all the way to January 2013, the second public draft, and what we're doing tonight is to try to get you ready to look at that draft. So the standards have a particular format here. This is an example of a page from the May draft and has different elements on the page. There are performance expectations at the top here, the outcomes that you're supposed to have. There are these elements, the foundation box, this whole element here that has those scientific and engineering practices, the blue piece here, orange of these disciplinary core ideas, and then the green cross-cutting concepts. And these all blend together. I should also point out that there are connections to Common Core and to elsewhere within the document. And you'll want to take a look at that. We'll make this handout for you available as well that you can use with people if you're engaged in a review to help you looking through the document. So here's just one performance expectation, one from that was done on the previous page. Construct and use models to explain that atoms combine to form new substances of varying complexity in terms of the number of atoms and repeating subunits. So if we go through here, we've got a section that deals with the practice, construct and use models, which is further explained down here. A second element of how atoms combine to form new substances. This is scientific knowledge in chemistry that comes from here and is further described. And then this idea of repeating subunits, that a particular individual atom or set of atoms will be repeated in a substance. So whether it's a water molecule in ice or if it's a single iron atom in a block of iron, that there's this pattern that exists of them repeating, and that is a cross-cutting concept. Now I want to point out that the performance expectation that we've got described here isn't a description of what you're supposed to do in your classroom. It is a description of what your students are meant to be capable of doing after they've engaged in learning. So for example, just because it says construct and use models, this is the practice here, your students still would probably be asking questions or carrying out investigations, using mathematics, engaging in all of the different practices to gain an understanding of this. But one of these practices, construct and use models, would be part of some sort of assessment of that piece. So that is a very brief description of what the standards are like, how they pull together, and in the different elements there for us to make use of. We could spend an hour or we could spend a day going over in more detail, but I think that gives you a general sense of what to work with. And I'd be happy to take some questions now before we get into and have Harold talk about the meat of planning a review of this document. And with that, I'll pass it to Bryn.
Thank you, Ted, and everyone, I'll remind you before we get started with our chat and question break right now that you do have the option of turning off those notifications of other participants joining the session. Simply follow those steps. You can also either minimize your chat panel or detach and expand it. I'll also remind you that you can continue the discussion there in the NSTA Learning Center community forums. And at this point, we'd like to go ahead and open it up to your questions. Feel free to type those into the chat window, and we will answer those.
All right, I've not seen any questions yet. I'll let folks take a minute or so to touch base on this. I think the important piece here is one thing to point out is that when you get your group going together, I think it's important to give them some sort of setting of the stage, similar to what I've done here this evening, in letting them understand some of the big pieces of what's going on here. All right, I see that we have a question about assessments. A lot of questions in assessment we don't really have the answers to. The National Academy is working on another report thinking about large-scale assessments, think sort of No Child Left Behind style assessments, and how could assessment system like that really go and manage to assess what the framework calls for and what the standards themselves call for. And their report is supposed to be out this spring as well. We also don't know what is going to happen at the highest, in terms of reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, aka No Child Left Behind, in terms of what states are being required to do in terms of science assessment. The two other questions here. Questions about how the standards themselves are arranged. The standards have specific grade level recommendations for grades K through 5 for the elementary grades. And then they're banded in middle school and high school. And Achieve is going to have in this draft at least some recommendations for different pathways, some different ways the standards could be organized in middle school. For example, you could have life science in 6th grade, physical science in 7th grade, and earth science in 8th grade. That's one possible thing. Or you could mix a little bit of each of those together. All right. So I'm saying the National Science Education Standards, I did mention these earlier, were one of the documents that were looked at by the developers of the framework, as were the benchmarks for science literacy and a number of other pieces of trying to take those into account into what has been done. Let's see here. Other consent. California, all states, I think, are set to will decide the standards in different ways. I see Jessica pointing out specific pieces of that from, I believe she's from the California Science Teachers Association, so it has a really good point on that. All right. We have any more questions here? I think we're probably at a good point to turn things over to Harold and go through. I'll just take what Megan's question here. This is a good one. This is Common Core only deals with math and English language arts, and so these will be standards for science, at least in terms of science concepts. There are a piece of Common Core that deals with reading and writing in technical subjects such as science, but in terms of what you should know about Newton's laws or evolution or other pieces, Common Core doesn't address this. This is similar to Common Core in that it is a set of standards that states can choose to adopt, just as they chose to adopt Common Core, and would lead to a lot of states in the country having the same set of standards, which would bring up a lot of opportunities to combine resources in developing curriculum, assessments, and other efforts. So why don't we go on, and I'll pass things over to Harold, and we'll get into talking about the draft, and I will try to answer some other questions as they go along in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted. Nice overview of the standards. I'm aware we have a fairly reasonable experienced crowd with us tonight that have had some exposure to the standards, so that's very, very helpful. There's a question that asks the question, what do we mean by study group, or would you use the same phrase for an NGSS feedback? I'll answer that question briefly now as I talk about the purpose of this review, and we'll come back to the relationship between the study group's work and the survey that will be and in the past has been attached to the standards. This particular webinar and the guide that we have developed, and I will share with you briefly as we go through the next part of this webinar here, is designed to help you with a study group. And the study group has a slightly different purpose than the survey attached to the Achieve document itself. Achieve wants to know specifically about each element in the standards themselves. That's an arduous task if you go all the way through it. We'd like to think of this process as a close reading by a group. And it may be a group that works together in a school. It may be a school district work. It may be the first step in thinking about and beginning the planning process for using these standards in the future. And so this will not only help the individuals better understand the standards themselves and provide feedback, it may begin to help that group begin its process of thinking about and, as I said, planning the implementation of the standards. It also promotes and prompts, I'm going to call an in-depth look, and discourages, as you'll see in a minute, kind of a quick and lightly perusing of the standards that is often a temptation, because it may be the first time you've seen them, and you may simply want to get in and just sort of see what's there. But the purpose of this review or study group process is to take a very deep and sometimes limited perspective. By limited, I mean only looking at a part of the document, at least as an individual. Even if you're an individual, I think this process will inform you very well about the content of the standards and what you have to think ahead about, and it will help you fill out the comment portion on the survey that's attached to the standards themselves. Our bumper sticker here is a very important point, and I just will emphasize it again, and you'll see this toward the end. This is a little bit like we think about teaching. An in-depth review is much more important than covering many of the standards if you really want to understand. I can't emphasize the fact, and those of you that have looked at the previous drafts will reinforce the idea that this is a very, shall I say, complex and very thorough document, but it takes time to get through it. It has very many dimensions, and you have to think about how those various parts of the standard are related to one another. So I think this will help you if you take time to do an in-depth and not a quick perusal of the whole document. There is a guide. We've talked about this guide previously in a May webinar and at the national conference last spring and the 3 area conferences. Ted and I both did presentations at one of those 3 conferences. So this is a review. It's obviously been updated for this particular release that you'll see released tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m., I believe, Eastern Time. The guide with very detailed support is located online at this website, so you might want to make a note of that. There are many other resources along with the guide, but I'll be referring mostly to the guide as we go through the rest of this webinar. It has sample agendas, very detailed. It has a detailed facilitator's guide, and of course the questions that we'd like you, suggest you and your group use. It also has a checklist, and I'm going to use to kind of help you plan the whole process. And I'm going to use this checklist as kind of on my agenda to take you through the process in a brief sort of way. So we'll highlight each part of the checklist as we go down. This first point will become a little clearer as we progress down and start looking at ways to select participants. But the first question you might want to ask yourself as you think about putting together a group is, do you want to deal with it in terms of, say, a subject matter such as life science? Do you want to deal with one particular grade level or grade span, such as middle school or high school? So you've got many choices. The plan that we're going to outline for you actually is comprehensive. Includes all grade levels, or grade spans, and all of the core ideas. But you can do it in smaller segments than that. So I think just keep that in mind as we proceed through the process here. Obviously think about time, place, and location, starting time. I think this will become clear as we proceed and as you study the guide. Internet access is important, but not essential, because you will be able to download the document. The survey, or the Achieve survey, is interactive, and so obviously you have to be online to complete it, but that could be done after the study group is completed. But it's probably to your advantage to have internet access during the time the study group is together. a little bit of information that will follow here about how to select and invite, or who to select, what kind of people, what kind of expertise, both grade level and content areas, and how to best utilize those folks during the process. So just a quick peek, going back to, I think you saw the slide earlier, this is the way the core ideas are organized in the framework. They are organized similar to this, but there are two versions of the standards, and I will get into that a little bit more in a few slides. The only thing I think is worth noting here is obviously that there's not engineering on here as a dimension, because as I think you know, or at least you will see here in a minute, engineering core ideas, disciplinary core ideas, have been integrated into one of these three core ideas: life, earth space, and physical science. You might just look at the notation here because this becomes useful. Notice that in life science, the first one is LS1. That means life science, grade 1. And then you see the title of that particular core idea. So that's the only thing I think you really need to note on this slide. There are 2 or 3 ways to think about your groups within your total group. One would be a life science team, or science, space science, or physical science. Another would be a grade span. And you see 4 possible grade spans here. Or even narrow the scope of any one particular group down to a set of core ideas such as life science and a grade span. If you then take these and think about the more comprehensive way to view it, which is really following following this model, and being comprehensive across the entire document, you'll see that if you use a minimum, and we suggest that you do at least 2 members in each of these cells, each of these groups, but it could be as many as 3 or possibly more. But if you did a minimum of 2, it would take 18 people following this particular model of how to organize your team, your group. Preparing the participants. You'll see a little bit more of this when we get down to the agenda, but again, I want to emphasize what Ted said earlier and what we have experienced between us and others as we've done a number of presentations about the standards since the first release in May, is that many, many questions come up when looking at the standards that can and have to be answered by referring back to the framework. So it's very important that your folks be familiar with the framework. The framework has many chapters. We're suggesting strongly that you look at chapters 1 through 8, which is the more specific matter of what is the content of the framework and therefore the content of the standards. That's some 200 pages, but I can't understate the importance of reading that material. It will facilitate your understanding of both the organization and the content of the specific material in the standards if you have had time to look at the framework. There are other resources which are also available on the website I showed you earlier that could be of help. A couple of these is there's the Reader's Guide that we published a year and a half ago about the framework. It doesn't replace the framework, but it may help you kind of understand and organize your study of the framework. And of course, on this website have been a number of articles and other documents that would be extremely helpful. But the framework is probably the most important one of the set here. Facilitate the meeting, of course. Here's an agenda for a full day meeting. We also have one that's a half day that's in the guide, but I will not show you. But it's very similar to this, except it eliminates one section and reduces some time. Notice the first bullet, introduction and review of the day. This is very important. Do not minimize this time, even though some of your folks in the groups, if you've used study groups before, you might be able to reduce this time. But even now, what they call the architecture or structure of the standard is significantly different. They tell us that 95% of the standards have actually been revised since the May release. So it's very important to orient folks, particularly new people, to the way to look at the standards, structure of the standards themselves, how you're going to organize the day. Maybe go back and review a little bit of material from the framework, but don't minimize this part of the day. It's more than just getting acquainted. It's a very important prerequisite for launching into the review or study group itself. Each of these sections, as you will see here, have time to both the individual groups to do their review and then reflection time or sharing time, because there's much to be learned by similarities or differences in the analysis of the document itself across grade levels or across subject area. I'm going to go through each of these sections and look briefly at the questions or the nature, the overview of the questions, not the questions themselves. And then, of course, take time for a wrap-up. That's very important at the end of the document. Here's some resources. The standards themselves, study questions, which you'll see in the guide itself. Inside the box, Ted has shared that with you. That's available as a handout. And the matrix, you're going to see a couple matrices here in a minute that help you understand the organization of the two different ways in which the standards are arranged in this release that you'll see tomorrow. Here's the reference to those two ways. This will make a little sense to you, and since we don't have a sample to show you, we'll just have to talk a little bit about it. But it'll warn you to think about the fact that there are two different ways, and they both have the same content. If you want to think about the sum total of all the standards, there's nothing different about what's inside each of these documents. It's simply the way they are organized and structured. And we'll talk about that for in just a minute. Something called by core disciplinary idea, and another arrangement, another document, you'll see two documents, by topic. And then they both have the same codes and the same language once you get inside the standards. But the collection or what you see on any one page may be different. Just be aware of that, and we'll briefly introduce you to this, but it'll take your time when you start looking at the standards to really get acquainted with this. This is by topic. I really think this is probably by grade level, but they don't call it that. If you were to open this document tomorrow, the first thing you would see as you scroll down is the Life Science Kindergarten standard page, and think of the whole page as being the standard. It's interdependence, relationships, and ecosystems, animals, plants, and their environment. And it could be a kindergarten standard there. The next thing you'd see would be the earth science, weather and climate, also kindergarten. And the third kindergarten standard page are structure and properties of matter. So that's why I say it's organized. It looks to me like it's, and I would label it organized by grade level or grade span. Obviously going on down, you start back with grade 1 and life science and so on. So it is organized that when you get down to middle school, you'll see a group of standards, as there are sometimes 2 or 3 standards in K-5. When you get to middle school and high school, you'll see 4, 5, or 6 standard pages in each grade span. If we're to look at a page no different than the pages you've seen before, what you may notice is that each of the performance expectations along here have a code. You see 3rd grade, life science, disciplinary core idea 4, and then there are several of the performance expectations. The other grouping is the label of this document is called Combined DCI, or Combined Disciplinary Core Ideas. And if you were to start at this document at the top, It so happens that the first set you will see would be the physical science. And you would continue down through the physical science standards on matter and its interactions, starting with kindergarten, going to 2nd, 5th grade, middle school, and high school. And then you would move on, if you kept scrolling through this document, into another physical science core disciplinary idea called motion and stability, forces and interaction. And again, start with an early grade, in this case it's the 2nd grade, moving down through high school. Obviously continuing on down through the physical science, you go to energy, and then finally starting with another set of waves and their applications and technologies for information transfer. If you were to scroll on down this document, you would then come to a life science set. And I don't think I need to go through it, but you would see first something from molecules to organisms and so on. And finally, the third set would be the earth and space science. So this is the so-called combined DCI document. You may have a preference. I have a mild preference for this particular document because one of the questions you'll see in a minute, or section of questions, has to do with progression. And progression, of course, is how ideas and concepts are developed over grade level, over time, if you will. Time being 12, 13 years. And that progression is going to be easier to ascertain, to evaluate, as you scroll down through a set of core disciplinary ideas, starting with a lower grade level, moving to a higher grade level. So I have a slight favoring of this particular organization that you'll see tomorrow. This is another way to look at this, but I don't think this has much to offer right now. So I'll move on. This is what one page looks like, no different, except over here you may see that they have picked up, these are all LSD4 because they're all in the same core idea. Okay, thinking about facilitating, don't forget that refreshments, lunch, the agenda calls for that. Let's look quickly at the guide itself and the organization of the questions. Again, this is online, easy to print out, not that many pages, and have available for every member of your group, your study group. Here's the first section, and we will not show you the individual questions, but this is just the categories of the questions. And this is where you really do get an in-depth study of the standards themselves. And this is where if you follow these and then go back to the survey opportunity to add comments, you're going to have lots and lots of comments to add to the survey that Achieve will attach to the standards themselves. Clarity and specificity, very important. Integration of the 3 dimensions. Ted's talked about that. This is very new, obviously, to most of us. And it's how they're integrated and being able to detect the integration of these 3 dimensions in each performance expectation and how to use the foundation boxes underneath the performance expectations is very important. Coherence of performance expectations. Do the expectations in the performance expectations, do they tend to support the same continuous notion of ideas, related ideas? Are they related? You're going to be very interested in whether you think your students in your particular grade level, your particular classes, or ones you associate with in your role, can achieve and are prepared to take on and achieve the performance expectations in the document itself. So the key questions here. And then related to that is what kind of instruction will be called for. Remember again, the performance expectations do not describe instruction, even though they sound like it. The action verbs, so to speak, and the practices sound like and can be considered and are related to instruction, but they are performance expectations which are the basis of assessment at the end of a period of instructional sequence or an instructional unit. I talked about progression a minute ago. That's why I favor slightly the version called Combined DCI, because it'll be much easier to look at progression across grade levels in both the practices, the core disciplinary ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts, if you're using that version. Engineering design, again repeating, engineering design is not a separate set of performance expectations. I'll show you in just a minute how they look as they have been integrated into the other three disciplines. Here's an example. Notice the asterisk. You're going to see it. Whoops, sorry. Notice the asterisk. In other words, one of these four in this particular set are an engineering design performance expectation that uses the content related to the disciplinary core ideas in this particular standard. If you want to know more about that, you can see it engineering. You can't read this, but you can see the core disciplinary ideas of engineering design in the foundation boxes. Another aspect of the engineering design is the section that was in the framework. You'll see it here as the interdependence of science, engineering, and technology. These have been added in the cross-cutting concepts. They are not in the original set of cross-cutting concepts, but have been pulled out of the engineering design core disciplinary ideas and inserted in the cross-cutting concepts and relate to and help you better understand the performance expectation that you saw in the previous slide. Nature of science is a topic, an area that has been of intense interest of NSTA, and we have recommended since the first draft that a section on the connections to the nature and history of science be included in the standards. So one of the important parts of our survey is to allow you to judge whether you think this recommendation has been adequately met. Again, they show up, connections to nature of science show up sometimes in the under practices and sometimes under cross-cutting concepts, or in this particular example, in both places. Reminder, what I said earlier, can't stress this enough. Take time to review the standards in depth. And last step, feedback. I've alluded to it several times. The study group has a broader purpose than simply providing feedback to achieve. But we believe, based on our previous experience and on the design of our questions and the structure of the day, that if good notes are taken, if each group documents their comments, their suggestions, their positive and their concerns about each of the performance expectations on each standard page, that will be a very rich resource to use in the Achieve survey. And so we encourage you to include those in your notes. Obviously, when you do that on a computer, they can simply be cut and pasted and added in the comment box on the Achieve survey. Those of you who have seen the Achieve survey in the past know it's a series of Likert responses for each page and each performance expectation, and then a box for comments. And so this will enrich and make your life much easier as you first fill out or respond to the Likert comments requests, and then fill out the comment boxes. Okay, enough from me. Questions, Bryn? Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Everyone, before we get to our break here, I wanted to remind you about a few things about turning off notifications. Just follow the steps. If you want to change the size of your chat box, that's how you do it, left arrow or right menu. And then, of course, continuing the discussion there on the NSTA Learning Center community forums. Again, here's the link for that. If you have any questions on the logistics side, feel free to send a private message to me or to Jeff Lehman. And now I'd like to open it up for questions. I'll have Ted and Harold answer those as you type them there into the chat window.
Ted, I'll let you kind of moderate this.
Certainly.
Since you've probably been looking at the questions while I was talking, or maybe you have.
We've had a few.
And between the two of us, we ought to be able to answer them.
We've had a few questions that come up. I've typed some answers into the chat window, but let me just go over a few things about some of the mechanics I think would be helpful to some people here. That tomorrow at 3 o'clock Eastern, the site should go live. You will be able to view the standards themselves on the computer screen, which gives you actually a lot of ability to do things like highlight different parts of the piece. What in the performance expectation, if you saw the slide I had that had the blue, the green, and the orange elements in them. I'm going to try to give you an example of that here in a second. The text that was here.
Want me to grab a couple of questions?
Yes, and we've got a couple here. Great. But I was going to say you also can have grab a PDF, either of the two formats that exist, but the website will give you a little bit more information to work with some pop-up windows and other things like this. Lindsay's asking, will NSTA be making recommendations on this draft? We will be going through and looking at it. We have actually set up and have, I believe it's 750 people who signed up in December to provide us some feedback. We also have a review committee of some experts in science education. Harold's on that, about 4 or 5 different former presidents of NSTA who have been involved in providing some guidance, and obviously our existing board is involved and leadership is involved in feeding back into pieces here. We also would certainly encourage, if you're interested in providing feedback, to engage in the discussion groups, because we'll be looking at what discussion goes on there and how people are feeling about things. Terry is asking about the engineering and technology pieces. They're not just referenced in the Crosscutting Concepts. They do appear in the orange boxes as well. It's just there's no separate page just for the standards sheet itself, all by itself, about engineering and technology. And actually, even on that, I should correct that they do pull them out from everywhere, so you can look at all the engineering ones together if you want to. But the idea is that engineering is ultimately then done as part of life, earth, and physical science. Harold, I don't know if you've seen a question that you want to touch on.
I think I see a key question here. Are the NGSS technically assessment expectations? This is a question that relates, I think, specifically to the performance expectation. Remember, there's performance expectation, and underneath are the 3 foundation boxes. The performance expectations are not assessments themselves. You might call them a framework or a guide for people developing assessments, whether they be classroom teachers or a larger group that might be developing a large-scale assessment later down the road. But the performance expectation specifically calls for the knowledge and the practice and the cross-cutting material or content that should be assessed following the guidance of that performance expectation. So don't read them as an assessment item, a test item, if you will.
I think that's an important piece here. So the way to sort of look at this is, if we think about the current assessments in the current state of science education in the country right now. No Child Left Behind requires currently science to be tested once in elementary school, once in middle school, and once in high school. And it's supposed to be checking and seeing what students understand about the science standards that exist in that state. So if a given state took the next generation science standards and made them their state science standards, they then would be expected to assess their students once in elementary, once in middle, and once in high school. And these statements, like I've got here on the screen here, construct and use models to explain that atoms combine and so on here. This is what the assessment developers would look at and to say, how could we construct a task for students to do as part of our state assessment that would have students show us whether they could or could not construct and use models to explain that atoms combine to form new substances of varying complexity. So it's some guidance. And in addition here, there's some specifics that says, clarification statement, that the atoms combining could include oxygen or hydrogen to form hydrogen peroxide or water, and some other things like that. So that is in some sense, what these standards are about and what these performance expectations are. They are guidance to assessment developers. It's one way to look at it. Did I give up anything there, Harold?
How developed will the connection boxes be to show connections to the Common Core State Standards in Math and English Language Arts? Right now, you just see a number. At the connection boxes at the very bottom of each page, you just see a reference to a particular standard from the Common Core State Standards. It's my understanding, Ted, you can check me on this, that when the final document appears in March, by the end of March, we understand that a mouse over or a click, there will be a link, and it will take you to the full standard in the Common Core State Standards.
I believe that is the plan,
so
yes.
It won't be on the standard page per se, but there will be a link that will take you directly to that standard.
Looking through here, some others. As is pointed out, that neither Partner, Smarter, Balanced are developing science at this time. Were the majority of edits focused on performance expectations, or were other parts of the document also edited in a major way? The main piece that the writers of the standards are working on are developing the performance expectations. The text of the core ideas, for the vast majority, comes from the framework, which has not changed. And then the general outlines of the practices and the cross-cutting concepts come from the framework as well. I do know that those were written for the May draft by Achieve. Again, the specific information about the practices, specific information about the cross-cutting concepts, and those have been reworked and re-edited as well, or rewritten. Again,
I think when they tell us that, you'll see in the front matter that tomorrow that she says something like 95% of the standards have been revised. So just to expand on what Ted said, it's my understanding that that's about almost entirely in the performance expectations. As Ted said, the foundation boxes come from the framework and are basically not changed.
Yeah. The 95% comment is definitely talking about performance expectations. I do think that, if I understand, Harold, that they have done some reworking to the matrices for practices and for cross-cutting concepts, but the extent of that those have changed is not necessarily huge. I mean, we'll have to look at those carefully to see.
Well, the matrices were added anyway. The matrices are not in the framework. The matrices, the cross-cutting concepts, just to remind folks, the cross-cutting concepts and the practices only had like grade 12 final outcomes, and it was left up to Chief to create these matrices so that there could be a progression of practices across the entire grade level span.
Great. So I'm looking here at Terry's question here, trying to make sure if I understand it. If someone asked to look at one NGSS, would you show them one page or one specific part of a page? My recommendation would be the whole issue of what the word standard means has been something that's been difficult in this process of having 26 states work together, because each of those 26 states, or at least some of them, have their own particular definitions of what the word standard means, sometimes codified into law. And those definitions don't necessarily agree with each other between states. So the word standard has become an awkward one for the writing teams to work with. But I would say the best way to get a sense of a standard, whether you were to show them a page like this, which is what we've been talking about, a single page which has a number of performance expectations, or was probably in the draft that's coming out tomorrow, the best way to look at this, you could show them, as I did here, one of those alongside the individual pieces from the foundation box that are connected to this. But I would definitely say you would not give them the full impression of what the document is if you just showed them the performance expectation without these additional things. So I would have to say, when you're trying to give people examples of things, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to view it like this easily, so that when you're showing people things, I would end up showing them one of these pages to give them a sense of what the standards look like. Harold, your thoughts on that?
I want to echo that very definitely. Having read a number of the performance expectations first, and then wondering exactly what it meant, you almost always have to look at the foundation boxes. There is no intention, even though some people may interpret it that way, in my mind, that the performance expectations could stand alone. You need to know what that practice really means. And that's a short paragraph, often 2 or 3 sentences. Same thing for the disciplinary core idea and the cross-cutting concepts. They have put phrases in the performance expectation that refers to each of those 3 foundation boxes, but it only makes sense to read it as a whole. By a whole, I mean the performance expectation and then the 3 foundation boxes. And they're clearly referenced. If you go down to the foundation boxes, as Ted briefly showed you, you'll see a reference under each one that has the code for the performance expectation just above it. So it's easy to make that connection I just called it for.
So in the example I've got on this page here, I know this is too small for anyone to read, but what I am circling in these 3 little places here is a lowercase letter a, which refers to that those paragraphs, this one, and this one, all contribute to or are considered part of defining what this performance expectation up here, letter A, meant. And so the foundation box is an essential piece. Another point that's related to this that I want to make is that while this performance expectation pairs a particular practice and a particular piece of content together and also brings in a particular cross-cutting concept, that doesn't mean that instruction should be done just like that. So in helping students understand this idea about all substances are made from some 100 different types of atoms, you may have them construct and use models. That certainly could be part of it. But you also would have them doing things such as engaging in asking questions, planning investigations. You could be using all of the practices to help them gain this understanding during instruction. In fact, you probably would really struggle if the only thing you had your students do was to try to construct and use models. They probably wouldn't really learn and understand things to the full depth you would need if that was the only activity you engaged your students with. So yet another reason not to focus solely on the performance expectation.
Very, very good point, Ted, and let me just take that one step further. As you review the standards, the performance expectations, one of the questions you're going to ask yourself, and you'll see this in the guide, is that performance expectation, in your mind, a clear indicator that you would use for assessment, or an assessment developer should use, that the student does understand and can use the practice, does understand the disciplinary core idea, and the cross-cutting concept? Would it be a performance that would adequately assess those 3 integrated pieces in the foundation box?
Great. Okay.
After all the instruction that Ted just outlined.
I'm going to move us along here, try my place again, if I can. See if I'm in the right spot here. I'm way still too early. Second. Here we go. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some resources for you to make use of either during your review or beyond in terms of all of the standards work that we're engaged in here. Clearly the place you're going to be wanting to visit tomorrow is the Next Generation's website, nextgenscience.org. You may want to take a look at that today or tonight, tomorrow morning a little bit, just to get yourself a sense of what's there. I would encourage you, again, if you haven't yet, to look at the framework, and you can find information about that on the National Resource Council's homepage. We're getting those sites put up for you. We'll get links to those put up on the main page. But my favorite, not that I'm biased or anything, in terms of where to find information about the standards, is on NSTA's homepage. You can click on our page right in the top corner here. You've got a piece that will take you to our information about the Next Generation Science Standards at NSTA. We are trying to be the ultimate place for all of this stuff. Bryn, I just want to note you're putting up things in the wrong spot. And so we will also have here some other materials that are useful, things that NSTA has pulled together. That we've mentioned the framework. I would also like to mention the Reader's Guide to the Framework. This is actually something that Harold did some work to put together as a guide to help educators get a sense of the framework, and sort of a guide, because it can be seen very overwhelming when you look at it first. We also have, in the last year, had a number of journal articles about the standards, including an article that talks about how to do a study group that Harold, Cindy, Murkowski, one of my colleagues who's in the chat room, and I did, that gives you some sense about how to go about this process. Bryn's mentioned several times tonight, and I would encourage you to continue this great discussion that you've been doing in our chat window into Standards Forum. Go in there and continue to what your impressions are about the standard, what questions you have, what are new ideas you've got about this big move in science education. I hope to see numbers of you in San Antonio in April at our national conference. The standards are supposed to be out before the end of March, and I've been told, 12:59 p.m. March 31st might be the actual point when they're finally released. Just a week or two later, we will have our conference in San Antonio, and I like to refer to it as the place to be to learn about NGSS. And so I'm hoping that most of you will be able to, 2 nights from now, to come and hear Stephen Pruitt, who leads the Next Generation Science Standards project, coordinated for Achieve. He will come and talk about the draft. You'll have a chance to glance at it a little bit tomorrow and Wednesday and hear him give you some more insights into what's going on there. I do want to note that it is taking place at 7:30 to 9 rather than 6:30 as tonight's web seminar is, and most of the web seminars that NSTA does. That's an important piece. I also want to give a thank you to Exploravision, because they had a web seminar scheduled for Wednesday night, and they moved theirs a little bit earlier so we could squeeze ours in later. And if you're interested in their web seminar on how to engage in Exploravision and win some prizes for your school, help your students really get engaged in thinking about invention, I would encourage you to go to our web seminar site. You can do a double feature on Wednesday night. So I know not all of you, in fact, were able to attend the web seminar series we did last fall about the scientific and engineering practices. If you'd like to hone up upon all of those, all of these web seminars are available in their archive on the NSTA website. And so take a look at all of the material there. And coming up are 3 more web seminars we're going to be doing in engaging the practices a little bit more. We're going to be talking about the engineering practices with Marielle Milana, who is one of the NGSS writers. We will be dealing with the practices in the elementary grades, doing a real close focus on that with Heidi Schwangruber, who was from the National Research Council, and Deb Smith, who was one of the members of the committee that developed the framework, and they'll give us some insights about the elementary level. And then Sarah Michaels from Clark University, who was the author of Ready, Set, Science. She will be doing a web seminar comparing the practices in next generation science standards with the practices in Common Core Math and Common Core English Language Arts and how those all relate to each other. So I think each of these will be on Tuesday nights, 6:30 to 8:30. We're going to just refer to this as all of Tuesdays with Ted as we go through this series. And because we're going to continue that, working throughout the spring, jumping from practices to the cross-cutting concepts. And while those aren't available to sign up just yet, we will have those in place for you down the road. It's coming up. And with that, we're going to go and see if we can pick up some more questions here. And you've got those pieces in place. All right. So, and I will second and third Ryan Rudson's comments that Cindy Passmore is amazing. I'd have to say that all of our folks who did those practices, web seminars this fall, were really fantastic speakers, and I was so happy that they agreed to do that. So with that in mind, and with a little bit more time left on the clock, what other questions do you all have? We've tired you all out. So I'm going back to a question Daniel had, a scary question, I guess. If your district were up for a science curriculum review, what would you advise us to do? Move forward or find a way to wait? My biggest advice to folks as they're trying to think about getting ready for these standards is to start engaging with the practices. That set of elements to work with about getting teachers to really get good at helping students to ask questions, getting students to be able to plan their investigations, to develop their own models and to use models to form explanations, to engage in classroom discourse. Having teachers build on those pieces, which can start tomorrow for you all, is going to get you in a position to be ready for whatever standards you have. Your state, if you end up keeping your current state standards, those are still good mechanisms for teaching and learning and things we want students to be able to do. And I think I can't think of a state in the country that those wouldn't be the type of things to do. Terry asks, what ramifications are there, if any, are there for if your state chooses not to accept NGSS? I'll be sad. That'll be a key piece in terms of ramifications. These are being developed for states to improve the quality of education in their state. So I think that's the biggest down piece. I don't know if there's any. I don't think that at this point there's any sort of, lightning bolts will be thrown at you or something like that. This is all a state-led effort. The federal government is not involved in all of this. There's no punitive actions that anyone would take, but it's in terms of what is going to be best for you. Harold, do you want to say anything more in addition to either of those questions?
I don't think so at this time, Ted. I think you covered it well. Thanks.
Christy asked, in the elementary grades, the topics are in a grade band and then do not repeat for another year or two. Example, weather, K2, K and 2. Should these core ideas be taught in these grade bands and not progress through every elementary grade as they currently are in our state? I do know when the Common Core came out, I'm going to make some references to research that is more in the area of mathematics and English language arts, or particularly in mathematics, that there was a lot more advantage of getting students to learn it and learn it well once rather than just touching on it a whole bunch of times. This is sort of the aspect of less is more that is being suggested here. So there is some aspects of that. That doesn't mean that you can't necessarily have your students, collect weather data. What's the weather like if you're in first grade, even if it's not part of the standard. But in terms of what you're really focusing on would be to work on fewer topics in each grade, rather than trying to do everything every year. I have a question here about texts and textbook publishers and how soon will they align their texts with NGSS. I would guarantee you right now, as someone who has worked in publishing, that there's some publisher somewhere who already has up on their computer new drafts of things that they say are aligned to NGSS, even though they haven't been finished yet. The standards themselves haven't been finished yet. So those claims will certainly be coming out very early in all of this. I think the key piece in all of this is looking at the standards and thinking about what is necessary to really do these. And a lot of people have been and will continue to, once the final is released, be looking at how do we deal with these resources. One of the things that NSTA is doing, a project I actually happen to be coordinating and working with Achieve on, is developing a set of criteria for aligning resources, or checking to see how well resources are aligned to particular standards. And we will have that document out around the same time that the standards themselves are released. And that document can be used not just to give a thumbs up, thumbs down, but also to sort of do a needs assessment. Where is a particular material strong? Where is it weak? And how could we satisfy that element? Robert asks, the argument, this too shall pass. When National Science Education Standards came out in 1996, they were around and made use of for 15 to 20 years. So, maybe NGSS will pass, but it will be 20 years from now, would be one of my answers. Harold, do you want to, maybe you would be a good person with perspective to lean more on that.
I don't think this is going to pass. I think it's going to take us, meaning the country or the individual states and districts, to move into and fully implement, if they ever are fully implemented, these standards. But these are not, this too shall not pass. Remember, it's been 15, 16 years since benchmarks and standards came out. That doesn't mean we're going to be 15 years before these are updated. But no, this is where we're headed.
I would also, two other things that come to my mind, one thing that comes to my mind actually is asking your colleagues in math and reading language arts whether they feel like Common Core is just going to pass by quickly, or whether it seems like it's really cementing itself in everywhere. I saw Elizabeth asking about what should be considered a standard, and my answer would roughly be part in what you're saying is it's up to each state to decide, or a better way to think of it is what's in a name. It doesn't really matter whether any of those pieces are called a name as long as we understand what their purpose is. The performance expectation is designed to give you a sense of what students should come out of instruction being able to do. And the foundation boxes and the other material underneath that really give you a sense of what that performance expectation means. And you need to pay attention to all of those elements. We'll take one more question here.
I have a question I think is worth answering from Ed. I don't remember from the first draft, but do the performance expectations address specific laboratory skills at any grade level? And if I'm following the meaning of skills, they do not, and inquiry outcomes or inquiry standards in the original standards did not address skills. They addressed the abilities, we call them in the national standards. These are called scientific and engineering practices, and they're essentially practices. Practices means doing something and understanding what you're doing. And so it's not just a skill being able to do it, but comprehending the purpose and role and place in the total learning and development of an idea process. So the quick answer is no, there are not specific skills in the performance expectations or in the practices themselves.
I would say the analogy to that in some ways as well is that there aren't specific definitions that people are supposed to memorize for the disciplinary core ideas. It's something deeper going on here, both in terms of the practices and in terms of the concepts in the disciplinary core ideas. One of the comments that Stephen Pruitt frequently makes is that if you can Google it, it's not a good standard. That if it's just a fact.
It's not to say that specific laboratory skills are unimportant. It's just
exactly
the final outcome or performance would describe in a standard. They're part of the instruction.
Great. Well, we're at the time where we should close up here. Let's Bryn give you the survey to pull through here, and then Harold and I will stick around after the survey if anyone has a few last questions.
Thank you, Ted. I would like to take this time to thank both you and Harold for sharing your time and expertise tonight. It was wonderful to have the information and the inspiration and motivation to start that study group, and everyone wants to thank you as well for your comments this evening. Thanks for your participation. I would like to thank the sponsor of today's web seminar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And a thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support for web seminars. Here's a look at our upcoming calendar. Tomorrow, join us for Analyzing Solar Energy Graphs, My NASA Data. And then on the 9th, start the evening by attending How to Avoid Disqualification in Explore Vision. And then join us for the later program starting at 7:30, the Introduction to the Next Generation Science Standards, Second Public Draft. You can register by going to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again on another web seminar.